Okay, yeah, it looks like we have about 20 folks or so online, and hopefully the folks online can hear me now. So before we start, I want to invite Mayor Wilson to come up and welcome you all to our meeting tonight.
Good evening. Welcome to the Quiet Zone meeting. I'm Jen Wallison, Mayor of Menlo Park, D3 resident. So we are in District 3, which runs along the entire Caltrain corridor. So this is a topic near and dear to me. I know you could have been anywhere tonight and you're here. And I'm actually going to need to head out in a few minutes to go to open house for MA. There's a play going on at Hillview tonight. But I think this is a really important topic. The meeting will be recorded, right? So if your neighbors missed it, they can tune in. I know information will be posted online later. I also look forward to this topic coming to the city council. So a lot of times with important topics, they go through a kind of process. And so this is one step on the process of the Quiet Zone. But thank you for coming, and you're in good hands with our city staff. So have a good evening.
Yeah.
Hi, and we also like to invite the Mayor of City of Palo Alto to introduce himself and welcome. Pretty cool. Thank you.
Thank you for having the meeting. I'm Mayor Wilson. Nice to see you. So thank you very much for holding the meeting and the study and having a joint effort in making this workout for us. Noise. You know, I do a lot of work as liaison for the airplane noise issue. And so I can understand on the ground level noise is also pretty difficult for everybody and definitely a health hazard. So thank you again for all your work.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you both. And so welcome everybody. So I'm, who don't know me, I'm Hugh Louch. I'm the Assistant Public Works Director for Transportation in the city of Menlo Park. And then Rapam, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Ripon Bhatia, City of Palo Alto Senior Engineer, managing the rail projects.
Excellent. And we have other city staff here, and then our consultants introduce themselves as well in a minute. But what I wanted to just do kind of quickly, and we can do this as we go, is just welcome you. Appreciate you all being here tonight. This is, as you see, a joint effort between the city and East and Palo Alto, and it covers 5 different crossings, right? So 1 in Palo Alto and 4 in the city of Menlo Park. And those we will talk about in more detail as we go through this. And we're going to kind of talk through some of the process and some of the other issues that go with creating a quiet zone. And then we're going to have some specific information about those crossings, which is also up here. And then after we get through that, we'll again kind of do some questions and answers, both from you and from the folks who are online. And then we'll kind of bring it back and talk about some of the specifics. So with all that, I'm going to introduce Peter from Kinley Horn. He's going to talk about the start of the process.
Great, thanks you. Peter Meyer over with Kinley Horn Associates. We are supporting the city of Menlo Park, city of Palo Alto on this quiet zone feasibility study and analysis. So as you mentioned, we have just a quick presentation here, 15 or 20 slides or so. We'll walk through kind of giving the basics of what the quiet zone analysis entails, where we're at in the project, and next steps to implement the quiet zone process. And then, as mentioned, you know, at the end, we'll leave some time for Q&A. If you guys have any questions, concerns, you can shoot away. And then as well, each of the analysis covers 5 different intersections, and each one is kind of detailed here. If you want to see the specifics of each one and the proposed design at each of those locations, we'll have someone, a representative at each one to answer any specific questions at those locations. So, all right. Without further ado. Okay, as mentioned, we'll cover the basics of what a quiet zone is and where we're at in the study for the quiet zone along this Caltrain corridor. And then where we're at today and where we're going. And so next slide. All right, keep going. We're good. I think you did, yeah.
Well, you know, well.
There we go. All right. So to talk a little bit on the specifics of a quiet zone, I'm going to introduce Brent Ogden here. Brent's got over 40 years experience working in quiet zones, design, safety. He literally wrote the federal highways Grade Crossing Handbook, you're the editor, so.
Yeah, with a send off like that, I know.
It's a hard question. So, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, well, thank you, Peter. Yeah, so a little bit of Quiet Zone 101. Okay, the railroads, this is a heavy railroad as opposed to like light rail, which you see down in San Jose. So this is regulated by the Federal Railroad Administration. And for many, many years, they worked on this quiet zone rule. I mean, that, just as a background on it, like I grew up in Chicago and trains don't sound any horns in Chicago. It's been like that forever. And as people started wanting more and more quiet zones, the FRA, had noticed they have requirements that this horn is supposed to be sounded, but places like Chicago had not been sounding it historically. So they were trying to write this rule to allow new quiet zones under specific criteria as opposed to just grandfathering them in everywhere. So they came out with this quiet zone rule. They're actually in the process right now, sort of taking a second look at it. And we've been talking to the people in Washington, so we sort of know what they might be looking at changing. But the bottom line is that the train horn is required to be sounded ahead of every grade crossing. And the sound is required to be 96 to 110 decibels, 100 feet in front of the locomotive. And just for reference purposes, 90 decibels is about the sound of a jackhammer. So it's a loud sound. And the idea is that the train should give notice 20 seconds, at least 20 seconds before arrival at a crossing. That's the basic principle, is to let people know the train is coming. So that's what's required. And I sort of mentioned that, the decibel level requirements, advanced notice, that's the essence of the horn blowing rule. And if you want to get an exception from that, then you apply for quiet zone under the quiet zone, the train horn rule. Next slide. So, okay, so the quiet zone means that the engineer is not required to sound the horn. Now, does that mean that a horn will never be used? No, because every engineer, if they see something ahead, they're going to blow that horn. If they're concerned about, safety, they're going to blow the horn. And the way it works with trains and train engineers is orange is the color, the warning color. So if they see construction fence, orange fence, the horn's going to blow. If they see anything, the horn is going to blow, if it's an exception. But if there's no exceptions and it's quiet zone, then they don't sound the horn. And the way it's done is there's a thing called a whistle post, which is by the side of the track, and it says, hey, engineer, you're supposed to pull the cord at this point. So when you have a quiet zone, it says no train horn, so they don't blow the horn. And the idea is that mitigations, safety improvements at the crossings would be put in. So what the FRA did was they crunched data from all across the country about collision frequencies with and without train horns. And they determined mathematically that if you can make safety improvements, you can make it so that the risk of safety without the horn, but with the treatments, is safer than with the horn and without the treatments. So that's sort of the basic, the basic concept. And the way you can do this, they identified what are called supplemental safety measures. And supplemental safety measures, there's just a handful of them. The most basic one is a long median, a 100-foot median. Or if there's an intersection within 100 feet, it needs to be at least 60 feet long of the nearest intersection. And it cannot have any commercial driveways in between that intersection and the railroad track, which is, so a lot of times you can't do medians. Now, one of our treatments, we can do a median here because we've got the 100 feet. But typically you need the 100 feet or at least the 60 feet, no driveway. So then you go to the next device, which is called an exit gate. So this is a gate on the side of the road where the traffic ordinarily comes out. And the purpose of the exit gate is to keep someone from evading the entrance gate. It's called an S-turn, when somebody will actually cut out of line. And it's more, here, this is like a commuter corridor. The trains are sort of moving along pretty quickly. They don't linger too long, but like if you have freight trains, like a mile-long freight train, those gates could be down for 3 minutes. So it's a big incentive for some people to try to beat the train to the crossing, which is of course not a good idea. But the exit gate will prevent somebody from driving in on the wrong side of the road. And once you do that, and of course now Caltrain's standard is to put in pedestrian gates as well. So once if you really have the exit gates and the pedestrian gates, you have what we call a sealed corridor, which means effectively that crossing is sealed off from people getting in the way of the trains when the train is coming. Now there are, as far as the safety measures goes, then, so between the exit gates, the medians, there's a few other things. You can convert the roads to one way. We had a quiet zone down in San Diego. We couldn't figure out a good way to get the devices in, so we talked to the city, let's make it a one-way street. So we actually took a two-way street, made it a one-way street, put in entry gates, problem solved. But you know, typically you want these SSMs. So if they're at every crossing, then you automatically qualify for a quiet zone. The other way to do it is the more hard way, which is to use it based upon the risk index, which is called the quiet zone risk index. There's two thresholds there. One is sort of a nationwide threshold, which we usually don't try to use that because the nationwide threshold, if the risk level drops nationwide, you could lose your quiet zone. Not a good idea. The more stringent one is to show that your quiet zone risk index for all the crossings is still better, you know, with the treatments than it would be without and with the horns. But of course, if you're interested in safety, you really want to put these things in everywhere anyway. So, you know, so some clients just say, we want the minimum cost. We're just going to try to do it mathematically and do it based upon the numeric score. Other jurisdictions will say, we really want to have the safest treatment possible, so we'll put them in everywhere. And that's basically how you do it. And but essentially what you do is, in order to put in these treatments, so all crossings in the state of California, the California Public Utilities Commission has authority over them. So you cannot change anything at a grade crossing without CPUC approval. And some jurisdictions are unaware of this. You're not even supposed to put a bike path in over a grade crossing without going to the CPUC. Because they have absolute authority. So what happens is the CPUC has a process and they do what's called a diagnostic. Diagnostic is a fancy term for educated people kicking the dirt out of the crossing, but you know, not to be you know, too facetious about it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that grade crossings and trains and roads, there's so many configurations, there's so many conditions. You go to every single crossing has always got something unique. And so the practice is not, okay, here's the cookbook, make it look like the cookbook. The practice is take the cookbook, take the design standards, apply them to the crossing. There's always decisions to make. You could do this, you could do that, you could do this, do that. So the idea of the diagnostic team is you get experts in all the different areas of public safety. You get the railroad operator, you get the railroad owner, you get the local police, you get the public works department, the jurisdiction having authority over the road. Get everybody out there in a group, look at it, have a spirited dialogue about what the right solution is. And when you do that diagnostic, that pretty much becomes the highest level of consideration as far as your design. And so you go through the diagnostic process, and then you apply for a permit from the PUC. You need to get your funds lined up because the permit's only good for so many years. So you get your funding lined up, you do the formal diagnostic, you apply for the permit from the PUC to make the modifications, you build the improvements. After the improvements are up, this sign goes up and notification is given to all the railroads and the users and the public, called what's a notice of establishment, which is sort of, okay, 60 days from now, this thing is in effect. And that's pretty much how you do it. Next slide. I may have gone past some of the material here, but okay, well, this is sort of what I just talked about was the permitting and the process. So, you know, agency coordination, conceptual design, public outreach, here we are. Permitting, to follow permitting, final design, funding, construction, and FRA approving the quiet zone. And you need to keep your quiet zones tidy. Some of the things the railroads hate is they hate when like landscaping grows up and covers where you can't see the flashing lights. So, you know, if you've got a quiet zone, the FRA's actually got people running around now checking these quiet zones, and if the vegetation is growing up over the devices, it's like. It's gonna be terminated unless you cut it back. So you have to maintain these. And so I think the next slide is probably, is that the corridor slide? Oh, okay, well, this is the agency, so these are all the agencies that are involved. So it's the two cities, Kinley Horn, Caltrain, PUC, FRA, UP Railroad has franchise rights on the rail corridor. And Caltrans. So all that has to be corralled and get agreement. Next. There's the card, okay,
All right.
take it away, Peter.
So I'll just briefly go through just the ins and outs of the corridor itself and the specific intersection. So we're looking at essentially 5 intersections: Encinal, Glenwood, Oak Grove, the Menlo Park, Head Crossing, Ravenswood, and then in Palo Alto, the Palo Alto Avenue / Alma Street crossing. It's about 1.5 miles in total. So next slide. And so each of these crossings were individually designed, but as Brent said, roughly, the 4 in Menlo Park are all would be 4 quad gate systems, right? So you have exit gates would be installed at all of those crossings, as well as likely even the existing ones would be removed and replaced just due to standard changes. So the Palo Alto Alma Street one, again, as mentioned, that is an existing median, and that would have be minor modifications to that to basically raise the median height to 8 inches to be acceptable for CPC FRA standards. Yeah, so next slide. So again, the different safety improvements that are typically utilized to qualify for this quiet zone would be the 4 quad gates, raised medians. We're looking at sidewalk realignments at each of the crossings. Refresh roadway striping and updated signage. So that's pretty typical. Again, 4 quad gates, I think Brent described it pretty well. That typically involves putting in new gate arms on the exiting component of these intersections, right?
Just one thing about the 4 quad gates, just so people understand. So the way it works is the exit gate comes down later than the entry gate, obviously, because if you just went past the entry gate, you wouldn't want to get an exit gate coming down in your face.
Yeah.
But there's also loops. So if anybody is on there, you know, after the exit gate has come down for whatever reason, the car stalls or something, not paying attention, the loops there will raise the exit gate, so it's, you don't get trapped.
That's it. Thank you, bad. Next one. Again, raised medians, as I talked about, the existing median out there today, unfortunately, is not 8 inches, so we'd have to raise that 8 inches. It's relatively minor work compared to some of the other intersections, though. And again, that's done so that it prevents vehicles from readily trying to jump over the curb into the exit, basically. So a deterrent. So next slide. Again, sidewalk realignments, all of our improvements in the 4 quad gate intersections would have new pedestrian gate arms installed and swing gates. When you have this infrastructure, it requires space, and so you have to kind of realign the sidewalk crossings to line up with that added infrastructure. So usually it's going to be set back a little bit right behind the vehicle gates, as you can see there. Okay, next slide. Roadway striping, that's, pretty minor work, but typically that's just to update for current standards. Refresh striping that's in the pavement, pretty straightforward. Okay. So the Palo Alto Avenue Alma Street, again, we're talking extending the medians a little bit, raising them to 8 inches, some minor striping and signage. Next slide. And just for reference, you see here in green means it's existing gate arms, as you'll see on these exhibits as well. If they're in blue, that means they're proposed either to be replaced or brand new. So. Okay. And then within City of Menlo Park, again, we're looking at 4 different intersections. Each of them would end up having the quad gate system. And I think it's important to note, as Brent talked about, the different ways of characterizing the risk assessment for this corridor. All 4 of these are not necessarily required to qualify for the quiet zone. So in fact, you could do probably just 2 crossings to qualify for quiet zone initially. Not to say that you wouldn't want to do all 4 from a safety perspective, but from the risk assessment standpoint with FRA, right? You could probably do a couple, I believe Ravenswood and one other one would be sufficient from a
And
risk.
then all 4 would be a quiet zone if you did those.
Yes,
They have.
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great.
Again, so another component of this is public outreach. So what we really want to solicit from you all are any questions, concerns that you might have, either about the process, about the design. We want to get input, maybe things you've observed at some of these specific intersections, driver, pedestrian behavior, things like that we'd want to address in the design, to make them as safe as possible. So. Okay. And then again, we'll, at the end of this whole process, we'll put together a final report with recommendations, including the concept designs that we have here. Brent talked about the field diagnostic meetings. We've already had those with CPUC and FRA. So these designs do reflect what CPUC and FRA would want to see at these crossings. So we have that. So the next steps would be after this to go into final design for construction documents. And then of course, funding would have to be secured, to go into construction. So, and as Brett mentioned, CPUC has 100%, control over permitting for these, but the permitting process with CPUC, since these are existing crossings, would be a GO88B application process. That typically, they're averaging only about a month to permit those. So it's really not that long of a process under CPUC. So, okay. Okay, just talk about that.
Good time to have a meeting.
Yeah.
In the real sense of it.
So mentioned, so permitting, final design, and then again, of course, securing the funding for construction. So, all right. Next slide. All right, any questions?
So as we move into questions, we just want to note, so we do have some folks online, so we'll probably mix in some folks who ask questions online. If you are online, then we get one question that we can start with. Instead of responding to you folks via the chat, which I could do, I'm going to speak them out loud and we can respond out loud so that everybody can kind of share the same information. And then we'll kind of go through some folks. And, we have kind of the time that we have available. We do want at some point to move over to the board. So we'll do some questions for a little while, see how long that's taking. And then at some point we might have to kind of switch to some individual discussions. But let's start with somebody online. And so we have a question from Nadia who says, can these improvements be paid for with money from high-speed rail? Isn't this already forecast in their EIRs? And I think what we can say to that is the high-speed rail EIR for this segment does include a sealed corridor. And that's because they're projecting higher speeds for their trains. However, that hasn't been finalized yet as an EIR, and they also don't have any money yet. So like the time frame for their implementation of it is uncertain. To the extent that we expect that process to continue and eventually get funded, absolutely. We have had questions. I know we've had some of our city council members ask at coordination meetings with Caltrain and with high speed rail, can we get a credit? And as we've had that kind of question asked, and the answer is like, we're happy to talk about it. So no promises from high speed rail, but it's certainly a important message, I think, for them to hear from the cities and from the public that, if you're planning to do this anyway, can we get ahead of you and maybe get funding after the fact? So.
And Hugh, you might want to mention, the existing treatments are good to 79 miles per hour.
Right.
And so if you put in the sealed corridor, that will take you up to 110. Beyond that, you're pretty much looking at a great separation.
Right.
Oh, right.
Yeah, and people know that high-speed rail, as it's planned for the peninsula, is 110 is sort of the max speed that they're talking about. So I think when we start here in the second row, make our way back.
So my question was, is this for whenever the train's running, or is this just at night? The time.
That's a good question. So to make sure people can hear online, the question is this for whenever the train is running or just at night?
You're quiet.
24 hours.
That's much better than I want.
You can do nighttime quiet zones, but you know, those are usually situations where crossings are actually closed at night, but you know, if you're gonna do it, it's all day long.
Well, this is so much better than I thought.
Sure.
This is great, totally supported. I imagine it's gonna take some time. In the meantime, while we're waiting for it, I measured 120 decibels, 100 feet from the track in my yard. Is there anything that we can do about the fact that they're exceeding that 110 decibel FRA limit?
Well, you know, that's probably a combination of the horn and the train noise itself. You know, I mean, even without the horn, the
It's
train
definitely the horn.
is definitely the horn. I'm surprised that it got that high because, you know, the legal maximum for the train horn is 110.
It's a couple times a week that it happens. It varies. But I would
Is
say
it a
the
freight
average
train or is it a passenger train?
passenger.
Okay, because some of the
Freight
freight,
trains are super
some of the freight locomotives have 5 train horns and those are a bit louder.
Is there anything we can do to say, hey, look, we measured this, it's out of spec? And you fixed it.
I don't know what the process would be to address that because, you know, the FRA is the one that mandates. And then you have to know which locomotive it was and, you know, it could be something where the sound is getting magnified, you know, sound does pretty strange things, so,
Yeah, you can probably report it to CPUC too.
yeah.
Yeah, that's something let's follow up on then, and, you know, we can also talk to Caltrain and let them know if we're experiencing, that and. PC.
Thank you.
Certainly, that's the other.
On the high-speed rail part again. I understood that we're probably gonna have at least one more track and maybe 2 more tracks put in to accommodate the high-speed rail. That would mean that all the crossings and so forth would have to be pushed even farther out. Have you taken that into account?
So this design does not, these designs here reflect the existing tracks out there today. So if high-speed rail came in, Caltrain came in, you know, years from now, decided to do a 3-track or even 4-track configuration, they would have to redo all this. And assuming it stays at an accurate and not a great separation, they would have to put in all the, you know, the mandated improvements to, again, keep it qualified for a quiet zone. Yeah.
And maybe just to be, so again, so people don't like to hear, the question was about, are we considering a potential track expansion? The one thing I want to add is that if you look at the high-speed rail EIR, you know that there are not plans in Menlo Park for anything more than 2 tracks that are there today. That's what's in the proposal now. Will they at some future point, well beyond when they can implement the first high-speed rail alignment, do that? I think none of us will be here to know, so. Later. Let me take one from online. So we have a question. This has been in discussion for many years. What has Menlo Park Council been doing to ensure this project can be financed without delay? And I guess what I would say that from our city standpoint is that, you know, this study was like a great sort of first starting point for us to kind of try to tackle that question, make sure we understand the process, make sure we have the designs, and then figure out what it's going to cost for us to move it from now to implementation. So that's kind of where we're at with that.
Hi, so a group of us are here from Palo Alto. And we're very interested in that, what do you call it? Alma Street and Palo Alto Avenue project. So am I understanding that you're gonna be recommending that there'll be quiet zones in Menlo Park and the Palo Alto crossing? Is that what we're getting? Why everybody's so happy here?
Again, for people online, the question was, are we recommending quiet zones in Menlo Park and Palo Alto? And the answer is yes, but there's some specific information that's, I think, important to understand about that, and maybe you guys want to speak to this, but the whole corridor is 1.5 miles or something like that, what you said?
Yeah.
So the Menlo Park crossings are all less than 1/4 mile apart, and what that means for Menlo Park is that we have to, any quiet zone has to cover all of our crossings. We can't have a quiet zone that covers just 1 or just 2 of them. It has to cover all of them. The Palo Alto Avenue crossing is far enough away from Ravenswood that it doesn't have to be part of the same quiet zone. And as Peter and Brent very ably explained, the Palo Alto improvements are much easier than the Menlo Park improvements. They're medians.
Just the median. That's
Right.
it.
So just a median, so medians cost less than the gates, and stuff like that, so that can sort of move on its own.
But are we just get in trouble with Palo Alto, because we've got lots of crossings going all the way to, Mountain View, basically. And are we gonna be, looking at doing the Palo Alto crossing without all those other ones? So are we connected to them?
No.
Is this a really?
So, thank you for that question, but yeah, your question is about like, can we do it separately and isolated from Menlo Park? And the answer is yes, we can do it separately and isolated from.
I think you can also do it isolated from your other crossings, which are past.
Yeah,
far enough away as well.
next crossing is Churchill Avenue, which is again further away from.
Separated already.
Yeah, Charleston, I'm saying Charleston.
Good question.
And can I ask one more?
When we come back to you, there'll be a lot of people, so how about in the back there?
This may be outside of the expertise of the people presenting, but one other safety issue is the traffic lights on El Camino impacting the cars crossing, especially at Ravenswood. And I'm wondering if there's any possibility of coordinating the lights so that you don't have people backed up with their red light on El Camino backing up into the crossing.
Yeah, so for everybody online, the question is, can we coordinate the signals on El Camino with the gates, essentially to reduce kind of backups that might sort of cause some of the safety issues that we see? You guys want to speak to that?
Yeah, the answer is yes. So that'd be a signal connection, the pre-engine signal interconnect between the two. Yes, that would generally be like that, yeah. So.
And one thing about that's important to know is that if they were closer than they are now by a little bit, that would be required. But because they're far enough away, it's not technically required. But if traffic volumes increase one thing or another, CPUC could say to us, we want to see that happen for us and Caltrans, because those are all Caltrans signals. They may ask for something like that, but I think this gentleman.
I know there's a lot of moving parts, but typically based on where we are in the process, how long does this usually take to actually be completely implemented where, we now have a quiet zone?
Yeah, so for those online, how long will it take?
So let's say, we essentially have kind of concepts designs here to take these to what we would call CDs, so construction documents, construction ready plans, it'd probably be about 9 months. That would include the CPUC GO88B process, to get it permitted during that time. And then construction, if we were to do these all concurrently, it's probably about, 9 months to a year, but they would probably be not quite concurrently. So probably about 1.5 years of construction time. That doesn't include funding though, of course. So funding would need to be secured before you can start construction. So.
I'm gonna take a couple online. So Lisa asked, does the work on the Ravenswood grade crossing align with this? So that's a great question. So for those of you, I think are probably all aware, we've got a bunch of projects associated with Caltrain in Menlo Park right now, and one of them is a grade separation project. Palo Alto also has grade separation projects. Those are very large, very expensive projects. The time frame, we're just in kind of planning for some of that work here, and the time frame is long, I would say. And so I think the way we see this and the direction we have from City Council is really quiet zone is something that we could get done very possibly sooner, get the kind of benefits of that in terms of reduced train noise. And while we're working on that kind of planning and those projects, of course, this will be challenging to fund, just because everything is challenging to fund, but grade separation will be very challenging to fund. A lot of money that's associated with that. And then let's see, we have a question. We had a question on schedule, so that was kind of discussed. Question, what would be required for Menlo Park, say Palo Alto, to make the decision to take the next steps to implement the quiet zone? Has this already been decided upon? And I think what I would say to that is, I think for both cities, this is sort of the first step. And then ultimately, we need our city councils to tell us, yes, we want to do it. And yes, we can get the money, and as staff, we of course can pursue grants and things like that. There are some grants that we could pursue to help with that may add time as well. But it hasn't been decided upon formally. I think we have very clear direction that this is desired from the community and from council. So it's certainly something as staff that we're working on, but really it's about getting that funding. Let me take another one in the room.
may have already answered it, but what is the biggest barrier or sticking point that you anticipate? Is it funding or?
It's the biggest barrier or sticking point.
Oftentimes, you know, you with the multiple stakeholders you saw here, sometimes there's not concurrence on what's, you know, everyone sees as the safest design, but in this case, everyone. The field diagnostic meetings went very smoothly, honestly, with everyone, and we're all in agreement, so really, it's, yeah, it'd be pretty straight line. There would be pretty straightforward going to the final design CDs, but yeah, it'd be funny at this point, is what I would say.
See the gentleman win.
Yeah, just a couple of questions. How is Alto cooperating, specifically with respect to the Palo Avenue intersection? How long do you think, how much do you estimate based on current high level designs it would cost per intersection? And how long would it take to get, for them to take to get funding for that?
All right, so first question, how is Palo Alto cooperating? How are you cooperating?
Now we have been collaborating well with both the agencies are collaborating well. That's why we are here together and working together on these 4x crossings. And there's cost efficiencies even in this process, and also understanding between the two agencies that we are working together. So there's good cooperation here.
Yeah, so given this looks like it's pretty easy to do the Palo Alto, is what I'm hearing. What's the holdup on the Palo Alto side from doing the Palo Alto?
So at this time, we are going through our process, and we do additional outreach through other committees and rail committees approval, and then go through city council and get the funding for construction.
Yeah, so what does that mean for Palo Alto then? How long? Because again, it's a pretty simple, it's like a pretty simple solution, and it should be a pretty simple answer. So
Yeah, so
how long we've been working on this for 10 years, and we've been hearing the same thing.
so the technical timelines is about within a year it could be constructed, but the process in itself, going through the approvals, going to the committees and getting the feedback and all that could add to it.
So how long are we talking to get financing for that?
The financing, depending, the budget doesn't seem like that expensive, so we should be able to work through our annual budget.
Maybe let's answer your question. You asked how much the cost is per crossing. Maybe you want to talk about like the Palo Alto, like the typical cost for median, and then the quad gates is kind of the typical cost.
Yeah, so the 4 quad gates are obviously much more expensive. Those, I mean, it depends on kind of the ancillary work when you're talking about the sidewalk and pavement improvements, but generally those are going to be between $1 and $1.5 million per intersection. For the 4 quads. For the median Palo Alto, God, I don't remember the exact rough numbers. Do you guys back there in the corner, do you guys remember? Can put you on the spot.
150.
Okay, so between, it's, yeah, a fraction of the 4 quad gate, yeah.
And we have Philip Cammy from our office as well, so it's
Sorry.
Philip Cammy, the chief transportation official from our office as well.
Right next to you.
You want to add to that?
So you had a
I think it's a great idea. Assuming this proceeds, how long will each intersection be closed off during construction?
So question about how long the intersections will be closed during construction.
That is a good question. It's pretty, actually, I wouldn't anticipate if there is full closure to be probably kind of the middle of the night type thing. You know, you have to maintain train operations and street operations during this construction. It's doing 4 quad gates like this is not uncommon. I mean, they do it all the time. So we were working on 50 intersections doing this across the north, you know, the Bay Area as we speak. So so generally, you would not see much traffic disruption for this construction.
Yeah, I think you need a really big foundation.
Yeah,
They do that.
exactly, yeah.
Fix the gate.
I mean, really, these intersections, a lot of it is work on the backside of the curves, so, yeah.
Let me take another one from online. Somebody asks, has anyone done a study to inquire if the pedestrian deaths and collisions on the train tracks have any relationship to horn sounds or safety mitigations at train tracks? And you, Brent, I think you kind of talked about this, about that relationship, but maybe you want to repeat that.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the train horn is gonna let people, I mean, you're talking about trespassers, you're just talking about people that are using the crossing, because the pedestrian treatments, yeah, the suicides, I mean,
I
Well,
think,
there are-
most people killed by our train are trying to be killed by. our
yeah, that's the intentional deaths we call them.
Right.
So there are, you know, been looking at this for many years. I mean, there are signs, of course, the signs are out there now, right? The suicide hotline signs. There are systems that Volpe is testing. That's the National Transportation Laboratory in Cambridge, Mass. And where they can actually do things like monitor cell phone, if they see like a cell phone signal that's lingering in that area. You know, they can dispatch somebody, and they've actually, you know, had some success with their system. So, you know, I think that the high technology, it's sort of prototype right now, but I think ultimately the high be helpful in that arena. Obviously keeping the vegetation down and making it so people can't, you know, hang out around the track areas.
But it's also really loud bell when the gates go down. I see that this will say like.
Crossing bell.
Yeah, it's so
Yeah.
really loud crossing bell.
So.
Right, but you know, the trouble is, you know, you get a kid that's got like the earphones blasting and, you know, that's how, I was just looking at the crossing that we're looking at making improvements down in LA and somebody had come from the elementary school and it was 2 tracks, so there could be a second train. And so, you know, the first train had blocked the view of the second train. He had the headphones on. Walked around the end of the train that he thought had already left and got hit. So, you know, that's, you know, so they, you know, that's why we like loud noises around train crossings, you know, but sometimes that still isn't enough. So,
Well, and with these crossings too, this is what we would call like the Cadillac of these crossing designs. So they include specific gate arms for the vehicles, and they, each one of them at each quadrant would have a specific pedestrian designated arm as well, and a swing gate. So it's got all 3 components, and that is what we consider like everything you can do at an at-grade crossing outside of doing a grade set, really. So, or an overhead head crossing, so. But.
I think this is a great idea and I fully support it. If everything went to plan, if we were on timeline, if there wasn't a lot of barriers getting the permit and getting approval, what was the earliest we would continue getting these quiet zones?
Yeah, it's a question for folks online. And I know a handful of people, I knew had the exact same question online. It's like, what's the fastest that this can happen? Which I think it's, and I hope you understand as staff, I think as a consultant too, like, it's the hardest part about that is knowing like, you know, we can't guarantee what other people can commit to, but you said sort of like 9 months for design, call another year for construction. I mean, so like in the next 2 years is possible. But, and probably easier for our friends in Palo Alto than it is for us in Menlo Park, just because our design is slightly more complicated, has slightly more complicated, you know, elements to it, has more funding need, you know, one thing and another. And I would say for the Menlo Park side, the funding needs gonna be the hardest part, like finding the required amount of funding to be able to support or build all of it.
And the other big difference between them two, unfortunately, is with these 4 quad gates, all the work is inside the Caltrain right away, right? So you're gonna have to have Caltrain coordination and construction involved with that process. For the Palo Alto, the work is outside the corridor right away. So you're not reliant on Caltrain to build.
Yeah, I'll just step back and say that we do still have to coordinate. And also like to add that the CPUC approval process can take longer than a month, you know, and we are working on, we're working with Churchill Avenue safety improvements, which is a high priority safety improvements. It's taking us much longer in getting approvals, but this being a simpler design likely would be more expedited way, but CPUC and FRA, even though we are having this diagnostic meetings that we are on, can take longer time. So that's why the construction time and the processing time at the city end could be different, and the overall project for the implementation can take a lot longer sometimes than, you know, than we can envision sometime upfront.
And just one other challenge I'll note, which I think relates to what Peter was saying, is that right now in Caltrain, like you all know, they're building an electrified railroad and 100% of their resources are spent there. And we have other projects in the city that we're working on, like the middle undercrossing and things like that. We can't even contemplate starting construction on that until they're done with their work. So realistically, that doesn't impact something like this too much, but by the time we get the design and the planning and the funding and all that together, it would be after that anyway. And that's end of 2024 is when they anticipate opening the electrified railway, but you know, that is that kind of question. One additional question online that comes from some folks in Palo Alto, which is sort of like, I'll boil it down to like, when are you gonna do the other crossings that are at grade?
So that's a very good question. We do have 3 other crossings at Meadow, Churchill and Charleston Avenue, Charleston Road. And we are hoping that as soon as we finish this, get approval from on this crossing, we will initiate a process for request for proposals to conduct similar process on those other 3 crossings.
You wanna-
Go ahead.
Sure, this question is really, I guess, for multiples of you on the panel, but funding seems like one of the big timing and hurdles in the Menlo Park area. What are the sort of major buckets, thinking creatively, of funding that cities bring to bear to pay for something?
That's a great question. You wanna talk about some of the?
Yeah, I wrote it down,
SB1.
SB1, yeah.
So I think the answer to that, which is sort of answer to any funding question, is like, there are federal funds that we could apply for. So there are competitive grants that come out that are for rail safety improvements. And just so you know, like, if we say we're applying for a quiet zone, we won't get funded. But if we say we're making rail safety improvements, which these are, that there's an opportunity there. So, those are things we could pursue. There are state funds, a lot of opportunities there. I feel like the state funds lean a little bit on the freight side. So the other counties are taking advantage of that have heavy freight volumes, like Alameda County. A lot of freight traffic moves through there. And there's that kind of option. Sometimes there are funds from our county transportation authority. We get a lot of projects funded through that. I don't think the transportation authority for San Mateo County has a dedicated rail bucket, so I don't know that there's anything we could specifically apply for there, but there might be things that we could creatively look into. And then there's, of course, local funding. The most of our local funding here comes from actually comes from quite a few different sources, but we do have like a transportation impact fee, which is that we charge to developers. That's helped fund some of the study that we're doing. So that's also a source. And inevitably, it's probably a combination of those things that we would end up using to try to fund something. But yeah, we don't have an answer today.
So just that, following up on that, you mentioned that in Menlo Park, obviously, I think, from safety standpoint, we'd rather have go full, Cadillac, I guess, for all 4. But from a pragmatic standpoint, you mentioned that we actually could achieve a quiet zone doing, I guess,
Just a couple of
at
them.
2. So, and that would then, instead of it being 1 to 1.5 million times 4, it would be 1 to 1.5 million times 2, right? So can you just kind of elaborate on that so we have a better understanding of, kind of like what would be maybe the fastest case, and then, maybe later we can fill in the rest. Can you kind of help describe that for us?
Yeah, I mean, let's say there's funding, you only have, 3 million in funding. So yeah, that would be enough to probably do 2 crossings, obviously not all 4 of the crossings in Menlo Park. And that would be enough to, get the process started for a quiet zone, yes. Now, Brandon,
You would target the highest volume crossings because they have the biggest risk factors. So obviously Ravenwood would never.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, it is. It shows up that way in the database, right?
So Ravenwood from a risk standpoint outweighs all the others because of the amount of traffic.
And just everything that's going on in that corner, there's a lot of stuff happening there.
In fact, you could do the other 3 and still not qualify if you don't do Ravenswood.
And I think it's really important to understand, right, that like then you're in the risk threshold kind of
Correct.
world, right? So then it's like it's not guaranteed to last, but as like a staging, right? We might think about that as an option, as a way to kind of get it faster while you're working on doing all the.
And the feds are talking about revising the rule to pull out that averaging criteria and requiring it at every location. So
it may not last, but maybe we get in ahead of
get in ahead before they rewrite the rule.
Yeah.
But how does that work actually if they do rewrite the rule then? I mean. are you
They have
right
to go
about there,
through
or
rule
is suddenly an old-
making, there'll be a proposed rule, and then it'll be comment period for so many days, and then they'll get thousands of comments from all across the country, and they'll have to respond to comments. I mean, rulemaking is a big deal for them. So
It can last like 5+ years to do rulemaking sometimes. I've worked on some federal rulemakings and it takes a really, sometimes it's fast, but it can take a really long time. So I don't know if we need that to be a barrier, but
Yeah,
it's-
I wouldn't worry about it at this point.
Thank you.
I had a follow-on question to the follow-on. So let's assume we're pragmatic and we want to start with 2, even if eventually we do all 4 in Menlo Park, but funding wise, we have enough for 2. Would we not be able to apply for the federal funds? Because if we do Ravenswood and one other, does that put us in the, it's no longer like you distinguish between quiet zone and safety improvement?
So there's still safety. Yeah, that's a great question. The question is like, does applying for only some of the crossings impact our funding eligibility? And I would say like any one crossing, like we could, especially like Ravens will be, again, because it's the highest risk, probably will perform the best in terms of pursuing federal funding. So we might only ever apply for federal funding for, I'm not saying that for sure, but like,
Crossing by crossing.
yeah, you could, well, you could apply for all of them, right? Or you could apply for some of them, and it'll be all these grants that come from the feds and from the state, like they have criteria and we match up the criteria and we scheme and figure out what's our best way to kind of perform well on those. So that's, we'll do the best, but nothing would inherently rule us out for funding if we didn't include all of them.
Yeah, I mean, the primary source of funds really at the state level is what's called the Section 130 program, which is a federal, it's carved out of the federal transportation budget. And it's administered by FRA, passes the money to the states, and then the states decide to spend it. Now in California, the Public Utilities Commission has a priority list for these improvements. And they won't show you the priority list. What you can do is you can go plead your case and they'll listen to you and then, okay, we'll think about it, but you never know. So, it could be a very long time to get money through the Section 130 projects when you consider that, there are crossings that have freight traffic that have, very significant issues in terms of things like, a record of fatalities and collisions and what I'm looking at this one down in Southern California, there have been last four collisions and last 5 collisions, 4 of them were fatals, with fatalities. So, they're going to target, those types of areas. But, I think you're going to be looking for something other than just going to the PUC.
All right, so back to Palo Alto, right? So we're all in this really high rise right there, 101 Elma, like 100, 200 people living there. You're telling us that for $50,000 to $100,000, this problem could be solved. Am I hearing that correctly?
Clarification on the Palo Alto cost.
The meeting, the raise to 8 inches, and that's it.
And extending that and some other information.
Yeah, and tell me, what can we do, because there's a whole bunch of people online, many of us here. I mean, it's really, there's a lot of sleepless nights you can divide by $50,000. So what can we do to get to the next step? And I have a lot of gray hair. I'm not gonna be here in the next 10 years.
Fred,
Anyway, not to.
what would it mean from a quiet zone standpoint if they isolated that one intersection? What could you do with that?
Yeah.
Quiet zone?
We could have one crossing quiet zone.
I mean, how long would that be though?
Oh, it needs to be 4, it needs to be a half mile length.
Be a half mile.
Half mile, but I mean, there's nothing else within a half mile, so it doesn't matter.
What is the next, when we came here, I'm hungry, I wanna go out. So what's the next thing? To get $50,000 out of the city of Palo Alto to do it?
Yeah, I think the cost is one issue, but the process, like I said, is that it will go to the rail committee, then it goes through the city council. It also has to go through PCC. So all these agencies needs to hear and get feedback from our community. Our community is very engaged and want to make sure that we give them adequate opportunity to provide input. So after getting all this input, we would get the city council authorization. Once the city council authorizes it, we would go through the design and design improvements for the construction. Now, it can also be lumped into some other existing overlay project or some near other project to create some cost efficiencies and expedition. But it has to go through GO 88B application through the CPUC approval, which requires their diagnostic meeting again. And so all these steps, just sometimes setting up a meeting can take like 4 weeks out. So even though we are saying that the design could be done quickly and expeditedly, but getting these stakeholders, CPUC, Caltrans, Caltrain, and getting service agreement with Caltrain to get this review and approve this project, all these steps have to be done in order for us to do. So I'm just providing you some of the background work that we have to do in order to this. And
So is there another side to this argument? Everyone in this
Yeah,
room-
actually, while we're doing all of that, it's going to get more expensive.
But it is a requirement from FRA and CPUC that we have to follow this process, and it doesn't take cost. That's why the cost is 100 to 150. That's why we say that, because all these costs add up.
But we're hearing city council approval is next, right?
No, it has to go to rail committee for PDC, PPAC, CS, city school, city traffic, safety committee, and then go to city council. Yeah.
Okay, couple questions from online. So a couple people have asked about Atherton, and we didn't talk about this one. Atherton has a quiet zone at one of their crossings, and is actually getting quad gate. Actually, if you know what, there are people online, and there's a lot of talking, then it gets really hard for folks here. So if we can do one at a time, I'd appreciate that. They have a quiet zone now. They're extending it to both of their crossings. They were able to do that for a couple of different reasons. I don't know all the details about that, but the most recent one is they closed their Caltrain station, and they were able to, and that sort of, they got funding through that process to install quad gates. So we don't have plans to close our station, and there isn't a desire to do that, and it would be very challenging. So that's not, we don't have that kind of path. But I don't know if you guys know how long their process was. I think their process was longer, as both Peter and Brenda said, and actually we participated recently in a separate process. You know, one of the things Caltrain's doing is changing their signal system. And that was a process where we had a GO88B meeting. 1 month later, things were sent to CPUC, and I think 2 months after that, they got approval for that. So it can move pretty quickly. So we have seen that happen. We do think the process is better, more efficient than it used to be. And I know that, so I wouldn't worry about the past so much, but yeah, just so you know. Pick another, somebody who hasn't spoken, so you in the back.
I have another question about funding. So it sounds like budgetary number would be about 5 million or something for the 4 crossings in Menlo Park. And city council would be aware of that budgetary number. So I'm just wondering how bought in to this are they, or is it going to turn out where they don't want to fund it? And if we can find that funding elsewhere, it'll go forward, but otherwise it won't. How hopeful should we be that we're going to get quiet zones?
Oh, that's a great question. So how hopeful should we be given? And did you say, who was the agency you asked about, Caltrain? Or your CPUC about funding it? So the Caltrain, the city, oh yeah, so all the funding will have to come from the cities, either through grants or through the city local funds. Caltrain won't fund this. It's nothing that they have to do, and they have challenges of their own from a funding perspective. So what I would say is that the direction we have very clear direction from our council to pursue this. I think finding the funding is going to be the hardest part for the city of Menlo Park. But certainly, and the mayor was here earlier, and you can tell that she's very excited about it, I think, and certainly I'd say all of our council members have been very supportive of this through the process. So, obviously, like anything, there's a budget coming up, getting funding added to that budget, that's a process that responds well to resident input. And definitely encourage you if this is sort of one of the most important issues. One other note I'll make is that we just had a city council priority setting meeting this last weekend. Some of you I know were there and participated, and fully of the comments we got in, fully 40% of them were about getting a quiet zone. So I think that they get the message that there's support for it. So we have one participant online who'd like to speak, which I'm going to allow. So Adrian Brandt is quite experienced in this area. He's going to correct something I said earlier and provide a comment. So Adrian, you should now be able to unmute and speak.
Thank you. Just a few points. Atherton did set up a quiet zone in 2016 that predated the station closure by quite a few years before it was ever really a done deal or even a certainty. And they did install quad gates with detection loops, such as was described by the expert. And it was interesting. It was the first and only quiet zone on the Caltrain line. And as the speaker said, that the engineers, I think as a protest, were continuing to blow the horns. So a citizen group there started to write down data on the violations, essentially. And Caltrain did have to threaten Caltrain with fines, and everything is fine since then. And there's a record of all this in the Almanac archives, the Menlo Park Almanac. It's pretty well covered. Also on the presentation, there are no drive around problems essentially on the Caltrain line because we don't have slow freight to keep the gates down for many, many minutes. And so you'll be hard pressed to find, looking back through the 20, 30 years of crashes, there are extremely few that are caused by drive around. So in calculating the risk index, it's a little bit unfair for Caltrain versus the rest of the country, but be that as it may. Also, cities have complete control, local jurisdictions on quiet zones, together with the regulatory agencies. The railroads cannot stop them. Petaluma, the entire smart corridor from Larkspur to Santa Rosa, was converted to a quiet zone, city by city and jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And I know Petaluma, over smart objections, pushed through their quiet zone. And that was also, you can see that in the archives of the Santa Rosa Press Democrat. The last point I wanted to make with the High-Speed Rail Authority, they did fund out of a different bucket, namely the bookends funding that they have for improvements. It's known as bookends on either end of the planned system, Los Angeles and San Francisco. They did fund 1/3 of the Caltrain electrification project well in advance because they both need and require electrification ultimately to reach San Francisco. So that was the rationale. And the similar rationale applies completely to quad gates. They absolutely need and will be required to install those quad gates when they're ready to do their major, construction on the peninsula. So it's perfectly reasonable to request $1 million or $2 million. It's pocket change for them, cash cushion change to either, pay back the cities or advance the funds to help fund those quiet zones. And then lastly, somebody asked about extra tracks. Staff correctly stated there's no extra tax plan through Menlo Park at this time. And even if they were to do that, CPUC does not allow any new crossings with more than 2 tracks, which is the reason why Redwood City does need to grade separate the new planned 4-track station that it's building, because you cannot CPUC for safety reasons will not allow grade crossings with more than 2 tracks, new ones. So that's not an issue. Okay, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Adrian, and definitely appreciate your investment of time in this and all rail topics. Yeah, so appreciate that and agree. And I think just to make a point on the high-speed rail thing, like we absolutely, I think as staff, I think as cities want to get funding from high-speed rail to do this. It's I wish it were that it was simple. It will take pressure and so we will need all of your help in that regard.
Again, on the high-speed rail, you said that Menlo Park is going to have a grade separation. That's not because of the high-speed rail. You're going to do one of your intersections with a real separation.
Yeah, let me, so the question is about, are we going to have a grade separation in Menlo Park? And what I would say is that we are studying grade separation. We've gotten to the stage where we have a preferred concept, and that preferred concept is for 3 crossings, where you partially raise the rail, partially lower the road. Palo Alto also has some.
How are you? depending on how you do it, I think it's gonna bear on what we do in Palo Alto.
Sure, yeah. Well, the distances between the two cities and locations is pretty far. So depending what happens, even Palo Alto Avenue, not too likely to influence Ravenswood. At least as I understand it, but also like that's a very important, but also kind of a separate subject from that. So I kind of want to avoid going down the grade separation standpoint or
You do
correction.
pay for an actual separation where you depress one and raise the other.
That's where our adopted city council priority is.
Say a tunnel.
Yeah.
Skyhook.
I just wanted to go back to Caltrain for a minute. Adrian mentioned it. I think Peter mentioned this. When Atherton did their 2 quiet zones, they ran into some reluctance from Caltrain and there was some pushback. When you were doing the implementation setting, have you picked up on any kind of similar pushback that we might expect from Caltrain or resistance?
Nothing direct. I mean, they were active participants in the field diagnostic meetings at every one of these processes. So their coordination and their input is reflected in these designs. So, yeah, there was no pushback though.
And I might note, right, like I think the issue that Adrian was describing, there's what the kind of designers and the folks who work in the office or they work in the field, say to us, and obviously their job is to say, what are the improvements that you need? How would we design them? What issues do we have with them? And then there are the engineers who operate the trains, right? And those are different people. So, I think the resistance he was describing was the actual engineers on the trains not wanting to obey the kind of quiet zone rules. And as you said, like, it's not actually optional. They have the option, but only in the case where they see an immediate safety issue. So if they're just every time doing it and not based on actual conditions, then that's a problem. But it seems like there's some learning through that. So we can benefit from the fact that this process has been gone through. And if a quiet zone gets extended, and ultimately like their crossings, our crossings, Palo Alto Avenue, they're all in a row. So as we sort of make progress on this, it will be a little bit more consistent. But I will tell you, because I have stood out at some of our crossings and seen pedestrians, kids usually open the gates when they're down, open the swing gates and walk across. So there will be horn noises because until people behave in the way that they're expected, you can understand for an engineer, that's really terrifying, right? I mean, it's terrifying for the person who might get hit, but it's also terrifying for the person operating that train as well. Yeah.
I just add on to that what they said at Fair Oaks is that for years, Caltrain said this can't be done, this is illegal, you will never get a quiet zone, and this was not the engineers, this was Caltrain.
Yeah.
And they also said.
That's changed.
Okay,
That's very much changed.
Okay, good. That's what I wanted to hear.
There's one other question on my, I just want to get to real quick, which is sort of like, can we just do the risk method? We just go straight for the risk method. And I think to be clear for Menlo Park, the answer is no. Like we need improvements at least some crossings to do the risk method. We are not below the threshold today. If we're below the threshold today, then we could just do the risk method, but we are not. So we would definitely have to make some improvements, at least 2 crossings, which is what we've learned. And then, kind of have to go from there. So I think we've reached a point where it's a little bit after 7. We do have exhibits at each crossing. I think we've gotten to most all the questions. There will be other opportunities in both Palo Alto and in Menlo Park to participate, to provide comments, a lot of meetings that are coming up. We'll put all that information on our respective websites. We will post the recording. And I think we'll stop now with questions and stop the kind of online piece of this, and then we can chat with you at the boards as you have questions. But thank you all.
Can I just, as one of the people who's kind of